In my work as a coach, one of the things that I come across on a regular basis is clients who struggle with understanding how to deal with problems, especially in the operations that they're running. And one of the things I want to talk about today as it relates to operations management, as it relates to managing how to deal with problems that come up in your business, is really to help you think through organizational problem solving. And this particular process for me is one that is often a result of understanding that a lot of times my clients, you may feel like what you're dealing with is like whack-a-mole all the time. It's like a problem shows up and you think you've solved it, and then just as you think you've solved it, another one pops up. And you get this perpetual motion machine of problems that are persistently showing up. And sometimes the dilemma with this is you spend your life putting out the fires that show up, but you don't often recognize that it may not be the problem that you're solving, may not actually be the reason why the problems are showing up. The problems that constantly pop up in your business are often not the real problem. There's something else going on. That's not to say that problems don't show up. They're unique and individual to a certain situation. But a lot of times when you have sort of the whack-a-mole game where you have this problem and then you have a problem that seems similar but slightly distinct, and you have that feeling of whack-a-mole, the issue is the problem that you are looking to solve may only be a symptom of a problem at a different level of your business. So it becomes important to recognize that if you've got a problem that's being created at a certain level of your business, and then you solve it and you fix it and it goes away, but another one shows up, and then you fix that one, what you fail to recognize sometimes is the problem is actually down here. This is just symptomatic. Yeah, it looks like a problem, but it's merely a symptom. And so what you have to learn to do is fix this problem down here, because remember, there may be 2, 3, 4, 5 of these whack-a-mole problems that keep showing up that are all related not to what shows up here, but what this specific one is. And the really interesting thing is if you have the understanding and knowledge and capability to solve this one, then what happens is all those ones at this level, they all go away, right? Because you've solved it at a root level and at a functionally different level in the organization that will really enhance what's happening for you. So the question then that you may ask is, what is the right level to solve a given problem in or at your organization? I noticed I spelled that wrong, in your organization. So what's the right level to do that at? Well, let's first decide what the levels are. I often work from sort of structures in my head. If you've watched any of my videos, I try and have mental models I work from. And this one has been particularly helpful to me as it relates to organizational levels. And so we start at the bottom as foundational and move ourselves up to being part and parcel of an organization. So I start with culture, I move up to expertise, I move up to processes, and then I move up to machines. That's how I think about operational organizational levels as one way of looking at it. I must again say that these mental models are not perfect. They're just tools. They're tools to help me look at things. And I hope as I explain this to you, it's a tool to help you look at it as well. So let's just look at what that means. So culture, what is culture? Well, to me, culture is the right core values, the right virtues, and the right standards in your organization. It's essentially the bottom line way people in your organization work, think, act when nobody's there and around to tell them how to do that. That's culture. Culture is that sort of that underlying sense of how people do things around here. The next level that I talk about is expertise. It's really the right people doing the right stuff. The next level for me is processes, is the right people doing the right operating procedures for the tasks, the operational tasks of your business. And then finally, the machines is when a process gets solidified in your business, if there's any possible way to outsource it to a machine, to software, to automation, to somebody else doing it in a way that you don't have to do it, or people on your team don't have to do it, primarily through the use of software, then you've got a machine. So that's the basic premise of the levels that I like to work from as I'm assessing or making sense of an operational condition. And so from there, let's dig a little bit more deeply in here. So culture to me is the baseline fundamental requirement in your business. Do you have the right values, which is how do we live around here? The virtues are what do we hold to be the non-negotiable minimum entry point for being part of our company, our organization. And then standards are what are the minimum viable standards that we live by in order to do the work we do, serve the clients we do, produce the results we do. And I believe if culture is going to be the right core values, virtues, and standards in the structure of your business, it has to be explicit, meaning you as an owner, leader, executive have to clearly identify what are the values you hold, what are the virtues you aspire to, and what are the standards that you will not break. And those have to be explicitly talked about, delivered, measured, rehearsed, restated, regurgitated, however you do that, they have to be explicit in your business. The dilemma is if they're not explicit, then they become emergent. And emergent values and virtues and standards are essentially like what happens in the back of the fridge when you forget to take that little jar of something out of the back of the fridge. Say it's sour cream, and you know what happens if you leave that and you're not explicit about ages on specific things in the fridge. They grow a whole level of emergent quality to them. And this is the problem when you're not explicit in your culture, is that your culture becomes emergent, and it's usually emergent with the strongest negative forces in your business, not the positive ones, generally the negative ones. And so what begins to happen in emergent cultures is cultures get infected by being emergent, and they're being dominated by under the radar weed kind of stuff that happens in your business. So culture as the baseline level in your business has to be right. Brian Chesky, who was the founder of Airbnb, when he got a $120 million investment from Peter Thiel at Founders Fund, I think it was their Series C financing, Brian asked Peter Thiel, what's the one piece of advice you're going to give me, or you would give me about the business and the investment you're making? And Peter said to Brian, don't mess up the culture. That was non-negotiable. Don't mess the culture up. Brian has subsequently stated numerous times over the years that, yeah, he messed up the culture, but that original statement rings really powerful and true. Don't mess up the culture, because culture, if it is not managed, infects everything else. All right. The next level, if we're thinking about levels, because what we're really trying to do in this conversation today is help you to understand how to solve problems at these levels. But you got to understand the levels. So the second level is expertise, is the right people doing the right stuff. But it's really important that when you hire people, when you train people, you've got to train people who already in some way align with, fit, or are trained to absorb and live out your culture, your values, your virtues, and your standards. Because if you hire the wrong people that don't fit that, then from there on in, everything doesn't work as well as it could. So expertise is the right people doing the right stuff. Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great, talked about right people on the bus in the right seats. So it's really, do you have the right people who live out the right culture? Next is processes. So if you've got your business is functioning on an ongoing basis, then what you discover is there are things that happen on a recurring basis in your business, a regular recurring basis that need to be addressed by your people. And oftentimes in businesses, one of the levels that we notice is that processes become operating procedures. They become ways of doing things. So these repetitive patterns actually become checklists. They become standard operating procedures. They become things that are replicated in a appropriate and effective way. So you really want to understand that there's a level in the business. Now, it's not as important as culture, and it's not as important as the right people, but it's still a critically important piece of your puzzle, which is, do we have the right operating procedures that keep the machinery of our business, keep the activity in our business working effectively in order to create a better result? Then finally, there are the machines. And this to me is, do we have the right automations? And by this, I mean, do we actually allow things that are recurring and repetitive that don't ultimately need human intervention to happen so that our business works more effectively? So when we get a payment in our on our credit card, does that automatically somehow show up in our QuickBooks account, right? That's automation. Whereas a lot of times what you'll find is that a payment comes in and somebody has to manually go do that. Now, if there is a process for that, that's fine. But what I know is in the world today, there are so many tools. They're often called APIs. And those APIs allow one thing that happens over here. If this happens over here, then that gets transferred over here as a data point, right? So there's automations. If something happens in your work order system, when that work order is completed, that then completes the work order in the system, which then translates to an invoice being created in the system, which translates to, that all should happen in an automatic way using the machines, the software, the toolkit that's available to us today. So when I think about these things, when I think about those four levels, then really what I'm doing when I'm trying to understand how to solve a problem in the business is I need to evaluate the level at which the problem exists. I need to make sure I understand, well, where does this problem exist? And then I only want to solve the problem at the level or levels that it exists. I don't want to do more and I don't want to do less. And so I want to explain those to you because this is the important part of this process is it's not just understanding the levels, it's understanding how to use the levels to really hone in on operational organizational problems that show up as a way to resolve them so you quit playing whack-a-mole all the time. All right, so let's dive into the first one. First one is to evaluate the level at which the problem exists. The first thing I just want to remind you of, if we think about culture, expertise, processes, and machines, is that the sort of the level between them here is not a clear line. It's not like if you cross over, you're somehow magically in machines, because processes done repetitively and there's some part of the process that's people and some part machine. There may be overlap there. Processes are done by people. Culture is impacted by people, right? So you might have defined a culture, but you hire somebody and they come in and their style impacts your culture in a positive way, which changes and adjusts it. So when I show you this, it's not that these are explicit levels. Granted, I hope they're clear to you, but recognize that there's some fuzzy lines between these boxes. They're just a model of helping you. So what we're trying to do is figure out, well, what level does this problem exist? So I've kind of extended this, and as an example, I'm just going to walk you through something. So let's say you have a workforce that is in vehicles, and they're out working, let's say with trucks, and you're out working on these trucks, and part of their process is to do a work order, to complete a work order, to fill it out on their phones. Let's say that's the mechanism for these work orders, on their phones or handheld devices. That to me is machine, right? So they complete a work order, they scan if scans involved, and there's a process that happens, and that process then sends it via some kind of mechanism, either within the software, back to the main database that's driving what the next step is. If something is wrong with that connection between the handheld and the sort of the home-based software, that's going to be a machine problem, right? That seems quite evident. The next one is, though, let's look at, say, those same drivers now having to manage the check of their vehicles, right? The daily check, either the start of the day or the end of the day check. And that is going to be less of a machine problem, because generally speaking, this has to be performed in a certain pattern, a certain way, every single day, every single time. So in terms of a process, we have a human being. Even if you're using software to do your actual daily checks, that process has to be engaged by a human who is following a standard set of operating procedures. Now, added to that operating procedure may have, if this happens, then you need to take this step. So if you're doing a check, and sort of the standard operating procedures, this is, you check this, you check this, you check this, you check this. But if the check shows that something's wrong, tire pressure is down, there's no antifreeze in the vehicle. I don't know what I'm talking about when I say antifreeze. I mean, there's a fuel, there's some type of substance that's not where it's supposed to be. Then that sort of creates a process whereby somebody has to go, well, what next? What's the next step I take then, right? So this is process. So if something's wrong in the process, that's your problem. But sometimes if you have a process that you're running through, but the process is wrong, you've got to actually drop one level back, and you have to have somebody who understands how to design process. So at this point, we're no longer dealing with, is somebody following the process? The question becomes, is the process correct? Is the process actually be done correct? And at this point in time, you need the right people who understand the dynamic of process of, say, daily truck checks, to actually be able to go into that process, make sense of it, rewrite it, reshape it to work for the organization. So now when people are engaged in processes, it is working. So notice how we're sort of taking levels. There's the software level, the machine level, and it drops to the process level, and it drops to the expertise or the capability to actually write effective processes. And then you might get into, well, what happens if my people are basically saying, no, I'm not going to do anything for you, I'm not going to follow the processes? Well, then maybe what you have is no longer an expertise issue or process issue. You might have a culture issue. And so I'm giving you those as an example so you can get a model in your head of how you should be pulling apart this organizational problem that you're experiencing. Toyota many years ago came up with a mechanism called the 5 Whys, and I believe it originally came out of Toyota, but I think it's a method that is really helpful, especially when you're diagnosing what level to look at the problem that you have in your organization or in your operation. And so the premise that Toyota came up with is, if you ask a clear why at least 5 times, or at most 5 times, you should come to the core issue. And that's really what we're searching for, right? We don't want to play whack-a-mole. So can we solve the problem at the appropriate base level, at the appropriate underlying level, to then solve all related problems? So you ask why, and then you get an answer, you ask another why. So to help with that, let's do an example. Let's say your car doesn't start. Car isn't started. So in order to diagnose that problem, the first question that you often ask is why, right? So why won't it start? If the car won't start, why? Well, let's say you diagnose for a little bit and the first answer you come up with is the battery is dead, right? So if you come up with the answer the battery is dead, then the tendency at this point in many cases and in many businesses that I help owners or executives dig inside of, what happens is instinctively what we do is we recognize the battery is dead, and what we do is we change the battery or we replace the battery. The problem is we should have asked the second why. And if we ask another why, we might discover this: the alternator is not functioning. I said this earlier. When I'm talking about car stuff, I really have no clue what I'm talking about. When I bought my last car, I didn't even open the hood of the car. I don't get this, but I understand intuitively what's happening here. So the battery's dead. But if you ask a second, well, why is the battery dead? Instead of just replacing the battery, you learn there's something at fault with the alternator. So the alternator's not functioning. Well, if you're stuck there, what you might do is just replace the alternator. But if you ask another why is the alternator not functioning, you might realize that the alternator is fine, but the alternator belt keeps slipping. So there's something else at play. It might not be the alternator after all. It might be the alternator belt is slipping. Now, why is the alternator belt slipping? Well, the alternator belt is beyond its useful service life and hasn't been replaced. It's actually stretched out, I guess. And so now you got to the fifth why, but there's still another why. Go one more. Why? Well, the vehicle was not maintained according to the recommended service schedule. Now, do you see when we get down here, if we're going to maintain the vehicle according to a recommended service schedule, while we might resolve this battery issue and the alternator functioning issue, do you see that if we follow this clearly, we might solve a whole bunch of other whack-a-mole issues on your vehicle? You might solve things like not just battery stuff, but you might solve things like brakes. You might solve other parts of your car that may not work. Why? Because you didn't follow an appropriate maintenance schedule. So if you get the maintenance schedule right, now you solve not just the battery issues, generally speaking, you might solve a whole bunch of other whack-a-mole things that show up in your car. All right. This is why I believe that toxic culture, when you don't have the culture right and when your culture's emergent and it's allowed to just grow at the back of the fridge and there's weeds all over your culture, and that leads to having the wrong people, and all kinds of stuff happens, right? Everything goes up from there. This is the base. So if you don't get your culture right, you mess up other things so badly. So it really stands to reason to understand where this issue is in your business. Now, the second part of this process is solve the problem at the level or levels where this exists, no more, no less. So don't solve problems where they are not, right? So it's the battery alternator thing, which is really a maintenance issue. If you fix the maintenance issue, you generally shouldn't have the battery problem or the alternator problem. You've fixed everything downstream of that because now you're solving the right problem and you've solved many more. So let's talk about how you can think about that. So the first one is, if you've got a problem with machine, so let's say that you've got people in the field and they're filling in they're using their handheld or their mobile to fill in work orders. Work orders are being processed, work orders are being done, but they're not showing up in the system. It makes zero sense to go and get rid of people at that point or replace people, right? People on the, getting the right people on the bus. It's not an expertise problem. Like, don't go digging down. You can ask the whys. The whys will lead you to stay that it's a machine problem that needs to be resolved. It stays at this level. It doesn't go any lower. Fix that issue. Fix the automation issue. Fix the data transfer issue. You don't need to go down here. Like, it's not worthwhile. So by asking 5 whys, you get to understand the level. And you may discover that if it doesn't go down any levels, you don't need to deal with anything more than the specific issue that's in front of you. But you may be down where processes aren't being right now. If processes aren't being done right, it's very easy at this point to go, is this a culture problem or is this an expertise problem? Well, it may be, right? So it may actually be a bit of the process and a bit of expertise. So if these are not being done right, if these processes aren't being done right, or a specific process is not being done right, you'll know because you keep running into a problem. There's a bit of a whack-a-mole game starts to happen. You start getting errors in places. Things aren't done. You're not getting truck checks being done properly. So what you've got to do is go back and go, is the process right? And you got to do your 5 whys. And then you got to go, well, is this maybe we need some rejigging of the process from an expert who really understands it? But it's not a culture issue. Don't go down and start working on culture when it's just a process issue that needs to be examined by an expert. So notice we've taken into account 2 levels there. So fix it at the level or levels that need to be fixed at, but don't go farther than that. And so sometimes what I see in conversations I have with owners or executives is what they do is they continue to see a problem. But what they do is then they go too deep in the system. They start thinking it's a culture issue when it's not a culture issue. It's merely a process issue or an expertise issue. All right. But what happens when you have multiple SOPs that keep breaking? SOP, 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 and the SOPs are breaking, and your whys go, the SOP is right. We've tested it, we've tried it, makes sense. You may actually discover you do have a culture problem, and you have to go right down to that baseline, and you might have to go back and start working on not so much what your values are, or that might come into play, but it might be how what standards you live by. Like, what are the standards you've set related to a specific set of operating procedures? And the people who are doing that. So there are times you have to dig down the levels, because digging down the levels solves all the other problems inherent above it. So, but don't jump levels if you don't need to. And the way you know not to jump levels is you use your 5 whys. Be clear on why something is happening and ask again. And at a certain point in the why questions, you hit a wall. So generally it doesn't take more than 5. It almost never takes more than 5, but dig down, and you go, okay, where does this land? Where does it make sense? All right. So there's the levels we've talked about. Figure out where the problem is at what level. Is it a machine? Is it a process? Is it a people thing, or is it a culture thing? And then once you've done that, fix it at that level. Don't go too low, or don't adjust things that are not within that specific zone. How do you think about this going forward? Well, hopefully you've got enough of that. But the first thing that I would do is recognize that most things in your business, most of the major problems in your business, are likely an issue at one of these 2 levels. This is how you build a long-term company. But if you're having a lot of errors and mistakes, this is where you need to do the work. So if you get processes right, and so many companies I look inside of, while they say they have processes, don't have processes. And those processes need to be amplified, defined, set up, made to recur in the business. If you can find ones that you can automate, by all means automate it. That makes life simple. But in reality, if you're going to fundamentally affect your business, you need to understand these lower 2 ones. I realize that's a lot to take in this short period of time, but understand that when you have problems, it's important to find where the problem exists. Understand where in these levels it might exist. And when you understand where it exists in these levels, then you can go to work at fixing it in the level or couple of levels that it needs to be fixed in. No more, no less, get it solved. If you want help looking at this kind of stuff in your business, I'm happy to give you my perspective on it. But this to me is a mental model I use to make sense of problems when I find them in an operation or organization. And hopefully, as I've explained this to you this time, it will make sense to you for what you're doing in your business and in your operation. Thanks for stopping by, and more to come.